Thank you very much, Father. It's very privileged for me to be back, to be addressing this meeting. The English critical edition of the works of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, marks the second time that the Knights of Columbus has collaborated with a distinguished academic institution to make available a scholarly edition of the collected works of a great saint of the Catholic Church. Earlier, the Knights of Columbus made possible the completion of the Yale edition of the collected works of Thomas More. And that edition was published by the Yale University Press of more than 20 books of Moore's collected works. So given the close connection of the Knights of Columbus to the pontificate of John Paul II and the influence of his pilgrimages in the United States, we felt it was only natural when the opportunity arose to begin a similar project regarding his work, and that is what we are introducing at this conference today. And we could not find a better partner for this work than the Catholic University of America Press, and especially its editor, Trevor Lipscomb. So we're very appreciative of that relationship. And also, I think I would like to express a real profound gratitude to the translator, Professor Gregor Ignatic, for what has been a very dedicated, meticulous, and I think outstanding contribution, which will carry us a great distance in understanding Karol Wojtyła. And also to the president, new vice president of the John Paul II Institute, Father Antonio Lopez, who's been such a careful guide and director of this project. And now, this week, I think, is the publication of the second volume, Person and Act, the Lublin Lectures and Works of Max Scheler. And I think with these two volumes, we are marking a new generation of scholarship on the thought of Karol Wojtyła and John Paul II, and henceforth our understanding of this philosopher, pope, and saint will be elevated to a new and much higher level. And it will significantly, I believe, influence the work of Catholic philosophers and Catholic theologians in the English-speaking world for decades and actually generations to come. Now, 4 observations why I think all this is true. First, the significance of the series regarding the problem of translation. I think most of us are aware of that, but from the earliest years of John Paul II's pontificate and, of course, of the founding of our institute, there was controversy surrounding the translation and editing of the English edition of what was then entitled The Acting Person. It was generally regarded that the first English edition was hardly reliable in any respect, and therefore serious scholars of Wojtyła were forced to use translations other than the one in English. And this serious obstacle to Wojtyła scholarship has now been remedied by Professor Ignatic in the new translation of Person and Act. And this development alone, I think, will significantly change for the better Wojtyła scholarship. But the problem was not simply one of translation. There was also a problem of philosophical bias. And as Professor Ignatic recounts in his preface to the present volume, Wojtyła himself was distressed by what had been done to his work, commenting, quote, "The elimination of the reference to St. Thomas Aquinas, what do I think of it? I think that it is right to show the author's own thought. However, I think it is wrong to efface all traces of dependence." And this was, of course, much more than a question of giving acknowledgement where due. Wojtyła was never one to use words casually, and the use of the word dependence in this context is full of meaning. And as Ignatic observes, this was, quote, a weakening of the metaphysical underpinnings of Wojtyła's work. And this too has been corrected in the present translation. And this too is a major contribution to Wojtyła's scholarship. Now, Professors Miguel Acosta and Adrian Reimers have attempted to categorize the list of scholars concerned with the thought of Karol Wojtyła as to whether they consider him to be a fundamentally Thomistic philosopher, a descriptive phenomenologist, or a realist phenomenologist. And I think here, volume 2 of this series will bring greater clarity to this question. The Lublin Lectures and Works of Max Scheler provides for the first time in English important essays by Karol Wojtyła and other essays by him that have never before been published. And these 2 volumes alone will make possible a new generation of Wojtyła scholarship. For example, in the section entitled Max Scheler's Ethical System as a Means of Developing Christian Ethics, Wojtyła poses the question whether and to what extent Scheler's ethical system is suitable for interpreting the truths of Christian ethics that are contained in the revealed sources. And Wojtyła concludes that the ethical system developed by Scheler is, quote, fundamentally not suitable for interpreting Christian ethics, as he does not concern himself with ethical good and evil from the perspective of the efficacy of the person. Nonetheless, Wojtyła finds that Scheler's thought can be useful in a secondary way, since it facilitates the analysis of ethical facts on the phenomenal and experiential plane. And as these essays on Scheler indicate, Wojtyła remains firmly within the Catholic tradition, yet appreciating the perspectives of contemporary philosophy as having the potential to complement it. Now, a second observation regarding the achievement of Wojtyła in the American context. The earlier attempt to downplay the influence of St. Thomas in the thought of Karol Wojtyła has been damaging in another way when we consider American Catholic theology and its antecedents in the 19th century Americanist controversy. As Michael Bradenbach observes in our Dear-Bought Liberty, Catholics and Religious Toleration in Early America, the price of acceptance for many Catholics during the 18th century was to deny both papal infallibility and papal authority in civil affairs. Some Catholics accommodated early American public orthodoxy by going the extra mile to disprove suspicions of disloyalty by embracing Republican principles such as lay ownership of parishes and the election of bishops. To defend the sovereignty against threats from Great Britain, the new American nation was willing to sign treaties of alliance and friendship with Catholic France. But the common aspiration in the United States to build a novus ordo seclorum meant cutting intellectual ties with throne and altar of the ancient regime, and that meant especially cutting ties with Roman Catholicism. Americans did not so much reject St. Thomas, they simply had never been introduced to him. Founders such as Jefferson and Madison may have read Romans such as Virgil and Cicero and Ovid in Latin, but they did not read the Roman Catholics. Every Catholic of prominence in colonial America took the side of independence and Republican government. John, Charles, and Daniel Carroll may be the most noteworthy for their Republican allegiances, but they were in many ways representative of their fellow American Catholics. They saw no problem between the new American democracy and their American Catholicism. Charles Carroll, signer of the Declaration of Independence, would say toward the end of his life that his proudest boast was that he had faithfully practiced the Catholic religion. Throughout his episcopacy, Bishop John Carroll insisted he had been elected Bishop of Baltimore by his brother priest, an election he claimed consistently had been merely ratified by the Holy See. Another example is Bishop John England of Charleston. England, a strident advocate of Irish republicanism, before his appointment as a bishop in the United States, established a bicameral legislature to govern his diocese. One house composed of laity looked after the administration of practical matters in the diocese. The other house, the House of the Clergy, saw to the pastoral and theological issues of importance for Charleston. But most notably, of course, Bishop England is remembered today for his prominent defense of slavery per se. England argued against the proposition that Pope Gregory XVI's encyclical In Supremo Apostolatus had condemned slavery. Instead, England maintained the encyclical was limited in scope, condemning only the slave trade. Pope Gregory had called slavery a shame to the Christian name, but Bishop England argued not so when the slave's owner was in lawful possession of his property. One could hardly imagine a more accommodating posture toward America's antebellum Southern culture. But perhaps of more historical interest, had Bishop England and his colleagues taken a different stand, one in alignment with the clear meaning of the Pope's document, one wonders about the impact on their contemporary, America's first Catholic Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, who, of course, is the author of the infamous Dred Scott decision. As it turned out, Taney's opinion in Dred Scott seemed entirely consistent with England's view of the slave issue. But by the end of the 19th century, many of Karol and England's views were no longer shared by their Episcopal colleagues. Nevertheless, their accommodating attitude toward American Republican values prefigure a certain resilient DNA within American Catholicism. Pope Leo XIII's later condemnation of Americanism has been seen by some as having a chilling effect on Catholic intellectual life by inhibiting efforts to synthesize the Catholic faith with contemporary modes of thought. Others have argued that coupled with the emphasis Leo XIII placed on St. Thomas Aquinas in Aeterni Patris, the Vatican interventions produced both a retrenching insularity of Catholic thought on the one hand, and on the other hand, a progressive leaning toward greater intellectual and institutional autonomy. Both documents were too often considered without reference to Leo's 1895 encyclical on Catholicism in the United States and its explicit reference to the mission of the Catholic University of America. That encyclical insisted that Catholics ought to be not followers, but leaders in the modern sciences, as well as in the study of the entire domain of nature. If due consideration had been given to Leo's encyclical on Catholicism, and if some in the Vatican had not been quite so convinced that the shadow of French republicanism was lurking behind what was happening in the United States, the temptation toward insularity within American Catholic theological circles might have been successfully resisted. Nevertheless, by the end of the 19th century, Leo's condemnation of Americanism was seen by many as having preserved American Catholicism from the path of what some have called the golden age of free thought in the United States. But the polarizing effect of the controversy succeeded in deflecting American scholarship, Catholic scholarship, from engaging with American culture. Regardless of one's view on the merits of either side of the Americanist controversy, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the controversy resulted in an unprecedented distraction, which in large part narrowly defined the Catholic engagement between the polarities of accommodation or isolation rather than a creative engagement with American society. In many ways, Catholic intellectuals too often sought to fit in comfortably to what William James had described as America's pluralistic universe, or conversely, to isolate themselves within that universe. Instead, they could have taken up the task of evangelization. That task was taken up by Cardinal James Gibbons in his classic, The Faith of Our Fathers, one of the most widely read books in 19th century America. But with the notable exception of Gibbons, it was really, in the main, a missed opportunity. The question which the Americanist controversy raised, and which the Roman intervention failed to resolve, was how to enculturate Catholicism within the context of the highly individualistic republicanism of American Protestant culture. The long hegemony of American Protestantism was rapidly declining amid the social and religious movements, the dynamics of which were discussed by William James in his The Varieties of Religious Experience. But these developments provided a new opening for Catholic dialogue with American culture. Pope Leo had outlined how not to proceed, but charges and countercharges regarding Americanism preempted a more fruitful exchange with the broader American society. And it has affected that engagement to this day. In contending with modernity, Catholic higher education in the 20th century, Philip Gleason sums up the situation this way. We can say that what happened in the 1960s climaxed the transition from an era in which Catholic educators challenged modernity to one in which they accepted modernity. Gleason admits that the generalization is oversimplified, but it captures the fundamental shift in attitude. But the intellectual achievement of Karol Wojtyła is instructive on this precise issue. His study of St. Thomas and St. John of the Cross did not preclude his openness to contemporary philosophy. Right? That openness can be seen especially in the Lublin lectures and essays on Max Scheler, which brings us to Scheler, Heidegger, and Karl Marx. While American Catholics through the end of the 19th century were dealing with the Americanist controversy, European scholars were dealing with an explosion in Marxist scholarship. Many of Marx's writings, as we know, were not published until many years after his death. One, most notably, was his introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, obviously an extremely important work in Marx's whole criticism of religion. These new publications resulted in a massive influx in scholarship on Marx, and according to one estimate, before 1883, there were less than 24 critical studies of Marx's work. Between 1884 and 1904, that number grew to nearly 300. And at the same time, Max Weber remarked that the intellectual world in which we now live was a world shaped by Marx and Nietzsche. And one of the most prominent and important figures in that world was Max Scheler, who rapidly became one of the most prominent participants in dealing with the new expanded scholarly corpus of Marx's work, as well as what he was doing with Husserl and others. Heidegger regarded Scheler not only, quote, as the strongest philosophical force in modern Germany, unquote, but as the strongest force in contemporary philosophy, an influence that would begin to be minimized as a result of the work of the Nazi regime, which did everything it could under Heidegger to minimize the influence of Scheler. In any event, Wojtyła's study of Scheler put him in the center of this intellectual world. And his study of St. Thomas and John of the Cross, St. John of the Cross, of course, put him in another intellectual world. But the fact that he was a participant, a serious participant in both intellectual worlds, gave him a unique perspective. But the decisive point here, it seems to me, is that Wojtyła did not find himself between two worlds, nor did he find himself alienated from either world. What the first two volumes of our series makes clear is this. The more Wojtyła engaged the world of contemporary philosophy, the more his work led not to alienation, but to moving more firmly within the heart of the church. Now, a third observation regarding Wojtyła and John Paul II's style. 25 years ago, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, in discussing changes which John Paul II brought to the papacy, emphasized that the Pope had exchanged the classical we of the papal style for the personal I of the writer. Ratzinger called this a revolution, and one that he said must not be underestimated. He added that this was not simply the substitution of a more contemporary writing style for an antiquated one, nor did he suggest that John Paul was speaking in his own name, offering private opinions or interjecting a new subjectivism into papal discourse. In fact, Cardinal Ratzinger emphasized that John Paul II knew very well the continuity that was affirmed by using the papal we in documents. Thus, Ratzinger then went on to say this: but those who make the effort to study attentively all the writings of Pope John Paul II will quickly realize that the Pope is very much able to distinguish between the personal opinions of Karol Wojtyła and the magisterial teaching as Pope. However, he also recognizes, quote, that the two are not mutually exclusive, but reflect a single personality imbued with the faith of the Church. Then Ratzinger went on to say this: the I, the personality, has entered fully into the service of the we. He has not debased the we to the subjective level of private opinion, but has simply bestowed upon it the density of a personality entirely shaped by this we, completely dedicated to its service. Having made this observation based upon his close working association with the Pope, Ratzinger then asked a profound question. How did this unity come about? How does a personal journey of faith, thought, and life arrive so deeply within the heart of the Church? This question bids us enter the intellectual and spiritual life of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, and of his life's work. And this series will help us do just that in a way really not possible earlier. And this is, I think, especially important as we consider the fact, the extent to which John Paul II wrote, we might say, his own material, right? I consider only the first 12 months of his pontificate. 2 months after his election as Pope, he announces he's going to Mexico. 1 month later, he's in Mexico City. 4 months after that, he's in Poland. 4 months after that, he's in Ireland. Then the next day, he's in the United States. The next day, he's addressing the United Nations. Then he's touring the United States. Also that year, he writes his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis. And whatever else the practice of producing magisterial documents during previous pontificates, does anyone doubt for a moment that every one of the homilies and addresses delivered by the Pope in Poland were not written by him? In fact, we know that until the mid-1990s, John Paul wrote his documents in his own hand. And then after that, he used dictation machines. But even without this knowledge of the Pope's work habits, is there any doubt that the impassioned statements made during these trips were not his own? For example, in Cuilapan, Mexico, he says to indigenous tribes, "The Pope wishes to be your voice, the voice of those who cannot speak or who are silenced, in order to be the conscience of consciences." Or in Drogheda, Ireland, "I proclaim that violence is evil, that violence is unacceptable as a solution to problems, that violence is unworthy of man." Or when he continued, "On my knees I beg you, turn away from the paths of violence and to return to the ways of peace." We could go on with many more comments, but I just can't see a Monsignor walking into his office one day saying, Holy Father, how about adding this to your speech? Right? This is all him. And it is, I think, reflective of what Cardinal Ratzinger observed in working with him. A fourth and final observation about John Paul II's engagement with modernity. This follows from what I think has just been said and what was raised by Father Lopez in his introduction to Person and Act. It is another example of the influence of Wojtyła, the philosopher, on John Paul II, the Pope. It is expressed in a letter Wojtyła wrote to Henri de Lubac, in which he said this: I devote my very rare free moments to a work that is close to my heart and devoted to the metaphysical sense and mystery of the person. It seems to me that the debate today is being played out on that level. The evil of our times consists in the first place in a kind of degradation, indeed a pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each human person. This evil is much more of the metaphysical order than of the moral order. And to this disintegration, planned at times by atheistic ideologies, we must oppose, rather than sterile polemics, a kind of recapitulation of the inviolable mystery of the person. Here, Wojtyła exhibits an understanding of the radicalness of the contemporary situation, as well as the radicalness of what his intended response would be, a response that would be central throughout his pontificate. And it brings us back to the very beginning of his papacy and the words of his inaugural homily. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. Seen in the context of the struggle for religious liberty behind the Iron Curtain, where the doors had been locked shut for decades, these lines, of course, had dramatic force. Obviously, the Pope had just introduced the possibility of a radically new Ostpolitik for the Church. But the question is, was it only Ostpolitik? Wojtyła's letter to de Lubac suggests the answer and helps put these words into a more profound context. After nearly 2,000 years of Christianity, the Pope warns us not to be afraid. But afraid of what? These words of St. Peter, which virtually every Catholic knows and has heard so often, have become, in a way, routine and commonplace. John Paul II will explain the radical meaning he gives to this proclamation and its consequences for the entirety of his pontificate. John Paul II begins his pontificate with the proclamation that Jesus is truly the Christ, the Son of the living God, and then the consequences of that proclamation. Open wide the doors for Christ. To his saving power open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. He alone knows it. John Paul II has taken the Christological anthropology of the Second Vatican Council, namely Gaudium et Spes number 22, and placed it at the center of his magisterium. And I would suggest that we consider the philosophical corpus of Karol Wojtyła, which we begin to see so clearly in these two volumes, as a sort of prolegomena to his papacy, and perhaps even as the keystone to his pontifical mission. If we understand modern liberalism as tolerating religion as long as it does not influence or disrupt the political order, then what are we to say when the leader of the world's largest Christian denomination announces that Christ alone knows what is in man? Our colleague, David Schindler, observes that the precondition for the emergence of the modern concept of freedom is not the denial of God, but the denial of his actual self-revelation in history. Modern liberty, he said, at its core is a rejection specifically of the incarnation, God's coming in the flesh. We may say that Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, saw this problem very clearly, and he saw it from the beginning of his pontificate in his inaugural homily. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. It would be difficult to find a more direct challenge to the anthropological assumptions, one might even say the mythologies of secular modernity than this. Against the tragic and dramatic failures of modern thought, well known to our philosopher Pope, John Paul II set forth a new engagement of the Church with modernity, one based upon the Christocentric anthropology of the Second Vatican Council. We see in the pontificate of John Paul II a Pope addressing the world squarely from within the objective structures of the papal magisterium, and at the same time from the experience of an active participant in the scholarly currents of contemporary philosophy. Wojtyła's work on Shaler could not be undertaken in isolation. It meant an engagement, a deep engagement with the broad context of European philosophy at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. To have a pope so thoroughly immersed in the context of contemporary philosophy had not happened before, has not happened before in the history of the Catholic Church. Wojtyła's active scholarship in contemporary philosophy is an indispensable interpretive key to understanding the pontificate of John Paul II. The real question isn't so much whether John Paul II was a phenomenologist or a Thomist. The more important question is how his work in contemporary philosophy helped him understand the crisis of the 20th century and how Catholics should and must evangelize the century in which we are now living. Understanding Shaler without the context of Heidegger or Marx or Nietzsche or Hegel's criticism of Locke or Kant, I think this is the true genealogy of Wojtyła's view that the evil of our times consists in the first place in a kind of degradation, even a pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each human person. The question raised by that assertion won't be answered today, but as Catholics enter more fully into the discussion of the future of a postmodern America and in what ways it may be influenced by Catholic thought, even evangelized, if you will, the question will move more clearly into the foreground of our discussions. And within that foreground, a prominent place will be taken by the critical edition of the collected works of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II. Thank you very much.